Hey, what's up, everyone? It's Darvell here. I just wanted to take a few minutes to make a long overdue video that I know is maybe a little late, maybe a little late to the game, but it's something I've wanted to do for months now. I've been crazy busy, and I think it's important to have this discussion, or at least to put this information, these clarification points out here into the atmosphere, because I haven't seen people doing it enough. I've seen a lot of discussion, and I think that this is important information to contextualize how the presidential election process works in the United States. I'm going to talk about it from the standpoint of the unspoken facts about the process. What you can do is, before I get into this information, a couple things. First, if there are any corrections that I need to make to the information I share with you today, I will put them in the pinned comment, the first comment underneath this video, and also I will reference them in the description of this video with timestamps and sourcing. Additionally, if you wish to make a comment about something that I made reference to, if I'm incorrect or if there's some context you'd like to add, please feel free to do that. But I expect any type of comment and conversation and dialogue around these things that I'm going to speak on to be respectful and to be directed at the objective evidence in the topic. I don't want anything personal. If there is anything personal, I will just simply remove it. And then last but not least, I appreciate you for watching this video. And I think that also it's important information to share. So if you do watch it and you do find that it's easy to understand and it's helpful, please share it with a friend, family member, someone who maybe voted already or will vote coming up in this election or the next election. And I think that will be great for all of us. So without further ado, let's get into what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about today is I'm talking about the U.S. presidential election here in the good old United States of America. And so as you can see over here, we have a map of the U.S. contiguous states and also Hawaii and Alaska. And what this map shows is, as we know, this presidential process in this country is governed by our Electoral College process. And so it shows the number of electoral votes allocated to each state. And as we know, there are 50 states in the union. However, we actually have essentially 51 voting states within the Electoral College. That is 50 for the actual physical states, then an additional one for the special district of Washington, D.C. Each one of these states have their own specific number of electoral votes. This is basic stuff I know all of us know, but Washington, D.C. was given an additional was given 3 votes, because the votes for every one of these states is based essentially on the number of congressional representatives the state has. So every state has a number of House reps that is proportionate somewhat to their population in that state. And then every state has 2 senators. So with that being said, Washington, D.C. was given 3 as just a static number, no matter who actually lives there in terms of population. And every other state has it based on population plus 2 senators. Additional to that, there are very simple rules that govern essentially how these states award these electoral votes in all but 2 of the states. And in those 2 states, they're awarded somewhat proportionately based on how they each decide to divvy up those votes, given how many popular votes come in for the presidential candidates in their state election. So it's important to note that essentially what I'm going to tell you is that these elections are waged on a state-by-state basis when it comes to the presidential campaigns. Essentially, as you see on the bottom, the state popular vote conceptual example that I have there, it shows Sarah with 1,000 votes, James with 100, Bob with 10, and Sam with 10. Clearly, it also shows at the top there's over 1 million registered voters. So what you're seeing is only 1,120 people actually voted. The point being that you can still win an election in a state if you have less than 100% of the voters who are registered in that state actually show up. It doesn't take you getting the majority of registered voters. You simply have to have more voters or more votes than your competition in order to win all of the electoral votes for that state for all except 2 of those states. Those other 2 will divvy that number of votes up proportionately. And so this is how the game is played, so to speak, is it's on a state-by-state basis. So why are they playing this game on a state-by-state basis? Well, there are over 500 votes up for grab, exactly 538 votes Electoral College has available. And all it takes to win in this game is 270. So that's basically the majority of the votes, is just over half, right? So when you have 270, there's no way to get around that. The big thing to remember here, though, is that, again, with that 270, these people who are casting their ballots in each state, casting their votes in each state, are not directly, so to speak, translating their votes into Electoral College votes. Instead, what's actually happening is you're voting for a set of electors who are part of the Electoral College. These electors are actual people who then in turn vote on behalf of the state. Their intention is to vote explicitly as the majority of voters voted in their state. So if you have a state with 12 Electoral College votes, they will have actually 12 electors from each of the representing parties or candidates available. And then when that candidate wins, that candidate's 12 electors will then go and actually cast votes on behalf of that candidate in the Electoral College. So it's essentially a transparent process for the most part, that when electors, these individuals, are selected to represent the winning candidate and that candidate wins, those people are basically expected to vote for that candidate in the Electoral College. So it really doesn't matter if you know there are people who act as electors or not. They're basically transparent to the process, except if they choose to be faithless. Faithless electors are people who decide to go against the will of the popular vote in their state. And if they choose to do that, they can try to cast ballots for other candidates instead. So in 2016, this actually happened once. That happened then in 2016. It's happened a couple times in the past as well, several times more than actually. However, it's never been really a significant thing that happens much. There was a lot of discussion in the 2020 and the 2016 elections about there potentially being faithless electors who could go against the will of their actual state and try to cast ballots for other people. We've seen that with the original Trump and Hillary Clinton matchup in 2016, when essentially people defected from both Hillary Clinton and Trump, and they decided to try to vote for other folks, and it became kind of a mess. But honestly, it didn't make a difference because not enough people left either camp to change the outcome of the election, as it was already essentially projected to go. So faithless electors do exist. They can try to upset the will of the actual vote from their state and try to change the outcome of the election. But it has only happened, I believe, maybe once in history, if at all, that they actually have turned the election result upside down. With that being said, if there is a tie in terms of the number of electoral votes won by a candidate in a national election for president, then the president is actually elected by the House of Representatives, with each state getting one vote essentially. So the number of representatives from that state doesn't matter anymore. They will just all collectively come together and pick one candidate, and that counts as one vote for their state. And then the Senate would select a vice presidential candidate similarly, with, each set of senators voting only once with only one vote for their state in order to pick a vice presidential candidate. And they do not have to actually be from the same party. From what I understand, there is nothing that actually says that they have to be from the same party. But of course, they probably would choose it as such. With that being said, as I said again, the battle for the presidency is won on a state-by-state level. So these candidates are running campaigns on a state-by-state level when it comes to trying to win the White House. So the big thing to keep in mind here is we're going to talk a little bit about some of the inner workings of how you vote for the candidate. And so you can see a picture of a ballot in the lower right-hand corner here. And so that's important to note because, again, each one of these candidates, or their set of candidates, the president and vice president, their campaigns are based on a unique platform of policy proposals. And then each one of those are their own mix of things that they consider as priorities based on their party's vision for the future of the nation. Now, each voter, important to keep in mind, each American voter is allowed and intended to vote for whomever they wish, as they wish, for any reason, and it is their right to do so privately without intimidation or coercion. You cannot coerce anyone into voting in any certain way. That is not what we do in this country. And people have the right for their votes to remain private. That's why there's so much scrutiny around privacy when it comes to actual casting of ballots. You see that they don't want the ballot to be exposed to the poll workers per se. They also have, shields around the sides of the ballot machines when you're actually voting. That's because those are supposed to be private individual choices based on what you believe and who is actually representing and going to push for the policies that you want to see the nation take a hold of. Now, two important points about the presidential election and all elections. First of all, information that is offered as fact, but is actually hyperbole or miscontextualized or even categorically false about candidates, about their policies, or about the voting process itself is what we call malinformation and disinformation. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about those in a minute, but malinformation is information that's out of context or hyperbole. And then disinformation is basically categorically false, things that are not fact. Additionally, when you take malinformation or disinformation as part of a tactic with intent to mislead voters, especially using these type of mechanisms to believe they must vote a certain way instead of as they wish, that is then voter manipulation. So when you take malinformation or disinformation and use it to lead voters into a false vision of what they can choose on the ballot or what is actually going on in their country in order to get them to vote in a certain way, that is voter manipulation. And that also includes, for example, telling people that they have only two choices on the ballot. This is straight up disinformation in the vast majority of cases, because when you look at just that picture right there, you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 choices on that ballot. President of the United States and Vice President of the United States, you have over 5 choices. There are even more under that we can't even see in the picture. So anytime you have someone telling you that you only have 2 choices, that is categorically false. That is disinformation. And it is set up to try to move you toward only voting for one of the 2 major parties, typically is why they say that. And so that becomes voter manipulation when you start to tell people they only have 2 choices. That is not how this process was set up or intended to run. And anyone who tries to broadcast such a thing as fact or even as reasonably the only choice you have, when they say it's, basically you can choose what you want, but honestly your vote won't count if you don't choose one of the 2 major parties, that's also malinformation if it's not straight up disinformation, because your vote will always count if you choose any of the choices on that ballot that are already printed on it. And I'll get into an exception later, but there's absolutely nowhere in the world, in this country, that you're going to be able to choose something like a libertarian or a Green Party person and somehow your vote don't count and somehow your voice doesn't make a difference. There's absolutely no basis to that. So the intention is for citizens to base their selection on the alignment of the policy proposals and the leadership intentions of the candidates with their own personal desires, goals, values, and what they believe is necessary for this country. It's not to be based around, of course, those protected statuses such as gender or someone's sexuality or their identity or their race or any of those things that, of course, in America, we strive for people to not be constrained or otherwise unduly given advantage or disadvantage by. So those are not the basis for your choices. Those are also not the basis for who can run for the high office of the nation. Now, With that being said, I do want to get into explaining a little bit more about the misinformation and disinformation I mentioned earlier. CISA here in the United States already has a very well understood definition set for misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. They call it MDM. And these are kind of like what they would refer to as information activities. Content of this sort can be either foreign or domestic. A lot of times we hear about disinformation or misinformation coming from foreign sources, but honestly, it can come from right here, from traditional news media. It can come from social media. It can be from anywhere, and a lot of it can be very much domestically generated. So misinformation is information that is straight up false, but it's not actually being used or distributed or actually created with intention of causing harm. So misinformation is kind of like mistakes. I will almost say mistaken information, almost like, misnomers, so to speak, right? It's not necessarily being used to, let's say, mislead voters or engage in voter manipulation, but it is information that's out there that's incorrect. It's false. That's misinformation. And you'll hear misinformation being confused a lot with disinformation. Disinformation is the same type of false information that's deliberately created and distributed in order to mislead, harm, or manipulate a person, harm or manipulate a social group, organization, or even an entire country. So disinformation is literally basically one form of propaganda, if you will. It's basically information that's straight up wrong, and it's being used to actually create a different outcome as intended by those who are distributing it. And then malinformation. Malinformation is one of the most dangerous versions of information that can be put out there as MDM. Malinformation is based on fact, but it's used out of context with the intent to mislead, harm, or manipulate, again, a person, social group, organization, or country. So malinformation is what you're going to run into actually more often in the mass media, because they can use a quote, they can use a video, they can use a picture, they can use all sorts of sources that show that there is fact in part of what they're reporting, but they may cut short the clip. They might take out the total context of the picture. They may make some type of manipulation to the reporting in order to lead you to what they want you to believe or see about that particular piece of factual evidence. So malinformation is really, you really identify malinformation because it's being misused in context. It's being used out of context. The context is missing. And so it makes you think something is going on that's actually not, if you got the whole video or if you were actually there or the other information that is part of the context is provided. So there's a big, I will say not a big lack, but there is a significant misunderstanding of some of these things. And honestly, because we're so trusting of media in some ways, and we have our own biases, the media that we consume can give us malinformation, but as long as it plays into our biases of how we think or believe or see the world, we will accept it without really questioning it. And that leads us to encampments of people who just stay in the same lane forever because they keep getting fed malinformation that continues to justify their view of the world, even when the context is totally missing, and actually leads to, when provided, that context can lead to a different viewpoint. So that is definitely part of the election process here in the United States. So let's look at an example of something. So we're going to look at the example of the state of Pennsylvania. I think this is important because the state of Pennsylvania is a place that is real, and the numbers I'm using are pretty much close to real for the last couple years of the state of Pennsylvania's elections. So Pennsylvania has 19 electoral votes, and it's a winner-take-all state like most. So that means that whoever gets the most votes in that state, no matter what percentage of registered voters show up, whoever gets the most votes is the person who actually gets all of the electoral votes for that state. So we're going to have a mythical election here, a little bit of a game here. And we're going to talk about 4 different characters. So we got Jolette, Hillary, Eliza, and Jarvis. So in this election, Jolette stands for, on his platform, his prominent features are free child care, no wars, and he wants open borders. Hillary stands for discounted childcare. She wants to fight Yugoslavia. She wants to start a war in Yugoslavia. She wants to shut down the border, and she wants to tax the rich. A reminder, these are totally fictitious characters. Then there's Eliza. Eliza's platform is a little bit more simple. She really just focuses on taxing the rich and giving away land for free to citizens. And then last but not least is Jarvis. Jarvis, his whole program is just reparations for the descendants of American slavery. He wants reparations. That's what he's really mainly marching on. So there's those four candidates, and these are the things that stick out about their campaigns that make their campaigns particularly unique from a policy proposal standpoint. These are the things that they're using to try to gain people's vote. However, of course, as we know, there's also a meta or subjective interpretation of all the known information about each one of these candidates that renders a public opinion of them overall. And the public opinions are as follows. So for Jolette, people see him as a radical hippie that's going to basically drive the country into poverty. So he's giving away a bunch of free, child care. He's not going to engage in no wars. He wants open borders. They just think he's going to run us into poverty. For what that's worth, whether it's accurate or not, this is what people believe. Secondly, Hillary. People see Hillary as an old, unsophisticated relic of business as usual. Then there's Eliza. Eliza is a big fan favorite. People are enthusiastic about Eliza, but she's a long shot because she's not part of any major political party. So that means money and promotion are harder for her because those parties stay focused on their own dedicated candidates. So they're always ushering that money through their party, and they're always getting the big donors who are already in line with those big parties to come and support their candidates. So she has to go out and stump for herself to get money with her volunteers, and she's finding it a lot harder than a traditional big party candidate. Then there's Jarvis. Again, Jarvis's platform is very unique and focused on a certain group of people who had a certain harm. And so he's very much a third party candidate in the traditional American ecosystem. And some people consider his agenda radical, right? So we have four candidates. We got one that's a radical. We got one that wants to give away free land. We got one that wants open borders. And we got another one who wants to start a war with Yugoslavia. So if we look at scenario 1 on the top right corner here, we see that in this scenario, essentially, if people just went with everything that's shown on the screen, Jolette would take home 3.2 million votes. Hillary would take 2.9 million votes. Eliza would come away with about 580,000 votes. And then Jarvis would get only about 2,000 votes. So clearly, Jolette has 3.2 million, which is more than anyone else. And so he takes home the gold in that scenario. Now let's change it up a bit. Eliza and Hillary have something in common. They both want to tax the rich. But Eliza's a long shot. She's not getting a lot of money. So she decides she's just going to drop out of the race. And she throws her support behind Hillary. And as ideally as we would like it to be, when these people throw their support behind another candidate, all of their original supporters as voters go and support Hillary. So now you see that 580,000 votes that Eliza had go over to Hillary. And that actually makes Hillary the winner of the election now above Jolette, because she was able to take that 580 and that moved her 2.9 million up to 3.5 million, which bests Jolette by about 300,000, right? So now all of a sudden, Hillary has won with Eliza dropping out. And also notice that Jarvis didn't get any of the votes. Jarvis is totally independent of all of this stuff, and he's still sitting at 2,058. Now, let's talk about that situation too with Eliza dropping out and supporting Hillary. There's a couple key points to keep in mind. One, Eliza's supporters moving to Hillary was not guaranteed. As I said, that was an ideal situation. They could defect elsewhere, or even worse, they could choose not to vote at all. So that's always a risk. And in reality, it's never 100% conversion. And then two, because half the voters see Jolette as a radical, they don't necessarily have to vote for Hillary. They may not like her either. So the reality is that in America, it's about voice, not choice, right? That's what this process is really about. When you get into it, it's not really necessarily that you have to choose what's just presented to you. Your voice also can be heard by not choosing any of these people at all. So again, when we see half the voters interpreting Drolette as a radical, they may not necessarily go and vote for Hillary. They might not like her either, and they choose to go elsewhere. So that's what happens here. And then thirdly, again, like I said, this is not a battle royale where you have to pick a side necessarily. This is more about making your voice heard, where you cast your ballot according to what you actually want, not what you don't want. Because here's the thing. If you always voted for what you don't want, then how does anyone know how serious you are about what you do want? If you're always giving your vote away to something you don't want, how does anyone know how serious you are about the things you do want? How do you create the change you actually need for your community or for your country? By picking people who are not even offering it. How does that work? It doesn't. That's what this process allows you to do. It's the voice that you don't even agree with who's on the candidate list today. And I'm going to explain how you can deal with that in a moment. But if we look at this again, just to be clear, in these scenarios, we have over 12 million residents in the state of Pennsylvania. 10 million of them are adults. And of those 10 million adults, 9 million of them are actually registered voters. But even with the 9 million registered voters, when you run the numbers of everything here, you only had a 76% voter turnout for this mock election. So that's what went down in the state of Pennsylvania for scenario 2. So keep in mind everything I've said here. Now, let's look at yet another development in the scenarios. We're going to look at scenario 3. So not wanting to lose, Drolette decides that, with Eliza out of the race and having thrown her support to Hillary, and then Hillary gaining all these votes, he's like, you know what? I got to say something else. I got to add some stuff to my platform. So Drolette comes out with 2 additional things about himself during this race. He says, 1, I'm wiping out everybody's debt. He said he gonna wipe out people's debt. He gonna get you debt free. And he started to lean more into his faith. He started to get more into his Christian upbringing, his Christian background, and how he views the world and interactions of the U.S. with his faith. Meanwhile, at the same time, Hillary does some things that are not so savory. Hillary ends up calling Jarvis the devil at one of her rallies. Then an undercover report is released proving that she's an atheist. They got her on tape. Then she says something else crazy at a rally. She says that the free land people, the people who wanted the free land that supported Eliza originally, she just insults them. She just says that they're loony. So these things that come out about Hillary kind of hurt her campaign. And as a result, she loses about 300,000 people in the polling. So now the things get really tight. She's dropped down to 3.285 million votes, but Drolette is still sitting at 3.287 million. The gap between Hillary and Drolette right now is actually just less than the number of votes that Jarvis has. Remember Jarvis? He's still sitting on reparations. He's still 10 toes down on business, but he got about 2,000 people behind him. So you got Jarvis there with the 2,000 people. And although many people support Drolette, many more don't like him enough to vote for him. Yet some of those people did not feel compelled to vote for Hillary either. So here we are. Drolette's back in the lead. So 1, whose fault is it that Hillary will lose? 2, why are people not coming out to vote with only a 76% turnout? That's not bad, but there's still a bunch of people who aren't at the ballot. box. And then 3, if Hillary needs more votes, what needs to happen? What needs to happen to get these more votes for Hillary? That is the question. These are the questions. These are very important questions. Whose fault is it that Hillary will lose, y'all? Hillary went out and said some stuff. She lost some voters. But now Hillary's short just 2,000 votes short of Drolette. And so is it Jarvis's fault that Hillary's going to lose because people support Jarvis because they think their reparations are important? Is it Jarvis's fault? And then what about the other 24% of people who didn't even come to the ballot? Why are they not showing up? And what does Hillary need to do to make them show up? Does she need to have more policies that appeal to the people who she alienated? Or the people who never were coming out to vote to begin with? If she wants to win, does she need to come up with more policies and more offerings for those folks to show up and support her? Because of course, as we know, if people come to the ballot box just because they're pushed to go by third-party organizations that promote, voter registration and voter turnout, that don't necessarily mean they're going to vote for Hillary. It don't actually necessarily mean they're going to vote for Drolette. If we're talking about a fair and free society that allows people to voice their political desires uncoerced and using only factual information, then they could go anywhere. It's a roll of the dice. It really depends on their personal values. So you do have to ask, if Hillary's going to win, what needs to happen? If she's going to win, she has to attract people to herself. Nobody else is responsible for Hillary's losses except Hillary. Now let's continue. I have a bonus scenario. The bonus scenario is very simple. Let's say we were able to get out the vote and get an additional 9% people to show up. So we go from 76 to 85% voter turnout. Ooh, we're killing it now, right? Look at these numbers. Drolette's still winning. Why? What happened, Darvell? Well, it's very simple. That 1.1 million people you were able to drum up to come out and vote, they exercised their right exactly as it was intended. They came out and they decided to write something into the presidential section. They wrote in global warming. Why? Because apparently about 1.1 million people care about global warming more than any of these things that these candidates were proposing. So when none of them proposed global warming, none of these voters felt compelled to show up to the ballot box. That's very unfortunate, and that's a misunderstanding about how voting works, because in reality, there are a lot more things to vote on than just the presidential section of the actual ballot. So they do need to show up still, or they should be implored to, but it is their right to decide what they choose on the ballot or not. However, the key is, when we think about the suffrage movement, when we think about the rights we're afforded as citizens, and we think about how we influence change in this country, the key is to show that you are not agnostic to voting. And so you will show up, even if you're not going to choose what's on the ballot, because when they know that you're willing to show up and you're exercising your right and you're exercising your muscle, then the candidates will be compelled to try to win those voters over, because they know they will show up. They just need to show them a policy that will allow them to choose them as a candidate over going with a write-in or actually just voting down ballot. See, most states allow write-in votes, even if they're protest phrases such as global warming. That's a protest phrase. It may or may not be reported that 1.1 million wrote global warming in the official election results by that state or that precinct. It may not be reported, but if they, as increasingly as it is, report all the raw data of the votes that were received in an anonymized fashion, then the media will definitely get a hold of that and make it known that 1.1 million people voted down ballot. That means they skipped over the presidential section, which means that they're voicing that they reject all of the candidates. When you skip that section, your ballot is still valid. And all other properly filled in votes that you make for the local and state level elections and initiatives and policies still count towards those contests. And those things are immediately more impactful to your daily life than the presidential election. So you can come in and write in a protest phrase. You can write in an actual write-in candidate. I've heard things like Mickey Mouse. We know Kanye West was a write-in candidate in some places. We know people have written all sorts of things. And those votes are important because they tell the nation, they tell the Hillarys and the Drolettes, if you want to win next time around, you need to come to the table with something that these other 1.1 million people want if you're trying to win Pennsylvania. Your voice is still heard. Your voice is still heard. And you still show up and exercise your right. And that's what many of us fought for. That's what this is. The power of voice when you vote. And they'll probably add global warming to their next policy platform if they want the 1.1 million votes for their party. So let's kind of recap this all. Let's summarize this up and shut this down. What was the intention of the suffrage movement, right? When we look at this mock election in Pennsylvania, it was to secure the right to vote, which is essential to the broader political representation and ultimately the broader equity in America that we all want for everyone's voice. Now, anything that's constricting diversity in voting and representation of individuals' ideas is oppressive and it's bad for America. That includes trying to get people to vote a certain way through voter manipulation or artificially restricting what choices they believe they can make on the ballot effectively through voter manipulation. These are common tactics that are used every year in America's presidential elections. Additionally, one thing to keep in mind that defaulting a vote, that is voting for a non-political reasoning, is the opposite of what the intention of voting is, right? Because we're voting on political candidates to become political leaders. That means that we're talking about policy. We're not talking about identity. We're not talking about gender, race, any of that stuff. We're talking about policy for the entire nation. Talking about the rules of how we govern our daily lives, essentially, in the world that we live in. That's what's at stake here. Now, what do you call the act of misleading voters to believe that they must vote a certain way instead of as they wish to do personally when properly informed? You call that voter manipulation. The notion of any entity trying to convince you that you are responsible to vote for a particular candidate for any reason other than your own priorities is honestly a miscarriage of democracy. Democracy is built on people taking their individual priorities, and as they see those priorities in the context of the nation and the nation's service to their priorities, and voting according to that. Nobody is responsible for anyone's vote except their own, and you don't owe anyone your vote except yourself. But you must choose yourself when you vote, because that is what makes up this nation. 300 plus million people who see themselves here and they see the nation as where they want it to go, and they vote based on what they believe is right. So you have to look at your own values. It has to be a decision you make. Therefore, you are not responsible for making any type of vote based on someone else's opinion or view. You are only responsible to yourself when you're voting. And yourself, there are 300 of yourselves, 300 million plus of yourselves in this nation. And then lastly, why do people not vote at all? It's mostly because they feel that there's little impact on their lives made by their voting choice. In other words, the policies being offered are not compelling enough to bother with casting a ballot, or they've experienced letdown in the past when their candidate didn't deliver on the policy they promised. So that's a risk. That's a big risk when you vote, but that is not something I wish to impart on anyone to discourage them from participating in the process. So if you know people who feel discouraged from past elections results, tell them to keep getting out there. Because when we all truly voice our individual desires and opinions for the nation, as in we're responsible for invoking what we believe is right. That's why we're responsible only to ourselves. Then we can truly realize a nation that is going to represent the will of the people collectively, right? Because every person cares in their heart for a better future for themselves. And part of the future for themselves regards the health of their nation. So understand, if you want best for yourself, as I say, you're responsible to yourself, then you also want to think about what does this look like for the greater good. But at no point in time should anyone or can anyone put a responsibility on you to be considerate of something that you don't value or you don't see the same way they do. Because you can only vote as you can see. Therefore, when we think about voting, we need to open up our minds and make sure we're taking in all the information and we understand things and we're getting the facts. And then we need to vote according to how we see and understand things. Don't ever let anyone bully you into believing that you must see things the way they see it. That is the opposite of liberty and freedom of speech. So with that being said, I just want to take a few seconds to talk about those finer points of the election process. There's a lot of information out here that I think is malinformation and disinformation about this process, because of course, those who have the loudest voice historically in this process seek to continue that favor and that leverage for themselves in this process. Therefore, there's absolutely no room in many of their views or anything that could take away from their leverage and power in this process. That includes political parties, political figures, and even organizations, nonprofit, NGOs, political PACs, all of it. So the number one thing that we need for each of us to make a difference in this country is to get the facts and make a decision on the facts, and to be vigilant against these things that can lead us off track. Thank you all for listening to this. Again, if you got any constructive comments or questions or additions or subtractions, please leave them in the comments. I love to see things that are constructive and engaging. But as I said at the beginning, if you want to make it into a personal attack or something of that nature, we won't accept that. Thank y'all, and talk to you soon.